Praise the Lord. For today's short devotional, let's look into the life of Hannah. What is the first attribute that comes to your mind when you think about Hannah? Yes, it's her prayer life. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 2, we see that Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Clearly, it shows that Hannah had a problem and emptiness in her life. In verse 6 and 7, it goes like this. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. It clearly states that God had closed Hannah's womb. Whenever things don't go as planned, just like Hannah, even we weep and would stop eating. We start questioning God without realizing that it was God who closed certain doors in front of us. It is not to harm us. He never has any intention to harm us. Rather, it is to show God's glory through our lives. We can compare Elkanah's love towards God's love. Elkanah loved Hannah so dearly, even though Hannah didn't have any children. Elkanah gave her a double portion. In verse 8, Elkanah says like this. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? He was always there by her side to comfort her and console her. Similarly, even though we were sinners, God loved us so much that He gave His only begotten Son to die for our sins, and He showed His greatest love for us on the cross of Calvary. God's love towards us is more than what the world could offer us. Never forsake His love. From 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 10 onwards, we see Hannah's prayer. There are a lot of key points which we could see in Hannah's prayer. Firstly, in verse 10, in her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. We see that Hannah poured out her grief before God and not before the world, because Hannah knew that only God can answer her prayers and only God can change her situations. Secondly, Hannah's prayer was a humble prayer. In verse 11, Hannah prays like this. Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son. She even thought that God had forgotten her. Many a times, even we go through the same emotions. We think that God has forgotten and abandoned us, but He can never forget us. For He has carved us on the palm of His hands, and He'll do a miracle for each of us at His right time. Just humble yourself, submit and pray to God. Thirdly, it was a prayer without selfish motive. Verse 11 continues like this. I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. Whatever God has given in our life, it must be made useful to God. Next, it was a silent prayer. In verse 13, we see that Hannah was praying in her heart and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk. Hannah prayed in her spirit, and although the world couldn't understand her, God saw her grief. She poured out her grief before God. Although the world misunderstood her, God saw and heard her silent prayer. Finally, it was a hopeful prayer. In verse 18, we see that she said, May your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Believe and have faith that God has heard your prayers. When she did all these things, in verse 19, it states that the Lord remembered her. And Hannah was blessed with Samuel, who later on became Israel's greatest prophets. Just like Hannah, let's have this personal communication with God at all times. Let's incorporate all these key elements to our prayer life. Let's pour out our hearts to God and see God's greatest answers towards our prayers. God bless you all.